If I'm right, back in my RYM days, right, there's always RYM romantic relationships forming that you're hoping for. And day one is usually when you meet her, right? It was just this kind of, you caught her eye and she laughed at one of your jokes or something like that, but it has begun. So I'm going to walk you through the process of what it's going to look like every day for you to have that RYM relationship. So, also aware that tonight is the night that we gorge ourselves in overpriced fried seafood. So I'll try to be done. I'll try to be done at 6:30 so you can get there. So, okay. Really quickly, where we are, right? We're talking about friendship with God. And last night, I tried to convince you that the number one obstacle in our life is not what we first think. That it's not the big failures that come to the forefront of our mind, but it's actually the good things about ourselves. That we don't know ourselves rightly and we think too highly of ourselves. And if we're going to become friends with God, we have to see who we are. So what I want to do tonight is see who we are and how God becomes friends with us. And we're going to do it through 2 Samuel 9, looking at David and his love for this person named Mephibosheth. Great name, right? Almost went with that name for one of my kids, but chose Shelby. And the reason we're going to do that, and this is, Tim Keller, I think, points this out. This is going to help you in your Bible reading. Whenever you read about King David in the Old Testament, Jesus, the most common human name that he is associated with, it's Jesus, son of David. Of course, he's of the lineage of David, but what that also means is when you read about David, that means when you see David's failures, is saying there needs to be a better king than David. It's to make you look for Jesus. But also it means when you see David at his best, what it means is you get a small glimpse into the window of what God is like, of what Jesus is like. And this passage is David at his best because he goes and he loves a nobody and makes them somebody. So let me pray for us. God, this is your word, and Lord, it is not natural for us to take a look at ourselves and see ourselves for who we are. We admitted last night that we like to stand behind the invisible barrier of our own righteousness. So Lord, would you do what's not natural to us? I guess would you do what's supernatural that can only happen through your word and through your spirit? Enable us to see with believing eyes who we are, and even better, who you are, that you are a God who loves sinners. I pray there'd be people tonight who would become friends with you for the first time, and others that treasure that in a more deeper way. In your son's name I pray. Amen. All right, 2 Samuel 9. If you hit Psalms, you've gone too far. Backtrack a little bit. Verse 1. And David said, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him? Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. The king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ameliel, at Lo-debar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ameliel, at Lo-debar, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. The grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of our God It stands forever. All right, the passage is just going to revolve around four things for us, right? First, the recipient of David's friendship, the friendship that's given, the continual bestowal of friendship, and the response to friendship. All right, first, the recipient of friendship, verse 1 through 3. Look, David is the king of Israel. This is the golden age, a time of peace and prosperity. It's kind of the high point of Israel's history. And David remembers a promise, a covenant he made to Jonathan, his friend, probably 15 years ago. Because King Saul had a son named Jonathan, and Jonathan loved David, and David loved Jonathan. Jonathan loved David so much that he actually risked his life for him. And back in 1 Samuel 20, David makes a covenant with Jonathan that he will not cut off his love from Jonathan's descendants forever. And so David remembers it somehow and is now looking for someone of the house of Saul to show kindness to. And that word kindness, it's the word that is always used to describe God's steadfast love for his people. That's why in verse 3, right, David adds, I want to show the kindness of God to Mephibosheth. So what David is about to do, right, David at his best always gives you a small glimpse into who God is. What David's about to do is going to be a picture of God's incredible love for his people. And so David brings Ziba, and Ziba says, well, there's just this one descendant left. He doesn't name him, he just says he's crippled in his feet. And the guy shows up, and his name's Mephibosheth, and that's kind of all you need to know about him. Here's who Mephibosheth is. There's three significant details. First, he's a cripple. And being a cripple, especially back in the ancient days, it was not pleasant. You were a burden to society because you couldn't protect or provide for yourself, so somebody else had to do it. He was helpless. Second of all, did you notice this? Ziba doesn't even name him. It's like he's embarrassed of him. And then when he says his name, Mephibosheth, you get it. Because that Bosheth, that is Hebrew for shame. That his name means shame. Because he is the last man standing of a shameful king called Saul, of a failed empire. In the eyes of the world, Mephibosheth just doesn't matter. He's just an embarrassment. And a reminder of an embarrassing period of Israel's life. But thirdly, did you notice this, right? When Mephibosheth walks into the presence of King David in verse 6, he falls prostrate, bows his face, and David has to say, do not fear. Why does David have to say, do not fear? Because Mephibosheth just knew. He just knew the reason that David was calling him into his court was to execute him. Why? Because that's what every king did of a previous regime. Right? When a new regime takes over, the easiest way to assure that there is no more rebellion is you just extinguish that whole line of people. It's what everybody did. And so Mephibosheth appears quaking in fear because he knows David's about to kill him and eliminate the last threat. So Mephibosheth's he's an enemy of the king. He's a rebel. So there's Mephibosheth's resume. Quite unwanted, right? He's shameful, he's crippled, and he's an enemy of the king. And it's this individual who receives the kindness and friendship of David. Even more than that, it's this individual that David seeks out to bestow with blessings. It makes no sense. You've got to realize this. This makes no sense. David has nothing to gain from this. But it's a window into the heart of God, into his kindness. Right, probably, some would argue this, but probably the best baseball player in the world right now is probably Albert Pujols. He's kind of had a rough season. He's coming back, though. Back when Pujols played with the Cardinals, due to his charity, what there used to be once a year was what was known as Buddy Day. And what would happen at Buddy Day is Down syndrome kids from the community would show up, and all day what they did is they hung out with one of the Cardinals. They got assigned to a player. And the kind of climax of the day, was that, right, when they were taking infield before the first inning, you would follow your player out onto the field and stand there at Busch Stadium next to your guy while they took infield before the game started. And so here the kid is standing next to Albert Pujols at third base while he's taking infield, and time's up, and all the kids are running back to the dugout. And Pujols' kid looks at him and says, "Hit one for me, hit one for me." And all of a sudden the other kids hear that, and they start saying, "Albert, hit one for me, hit one for me." And there's this just kind of roar of everybody requesting home runs as they run off into the dugout. Pujols that day smashes 3 home runs, okay? Goes back to the dugout, gets the game ball, and then, right when he gets the game ball, this is awesome, he beelines it outside to where there's hundreds of people, right, hoping to see Pujols. And amidst the crowd, he's looking for one person, and he spots him. And he yells, "Danny, Danny." And he walks over to him and he hands him the ball and he says, "I hit one for you." Right? Think about this. It doesn't take much to recognize Pujols' raw power and his ability to play baseball, right? Everybody sees that. But if it wouldn't have been for the incident with Danny, we would have never known Pujols' compassionate and gentle nature, right? We could say it took a mentally handicapped boy to put on display something about Albert that other people didn't know. Now, I want you to think about whatever good questions, and they're probably good questions you have about how this world can be so broken and so messed up and so sinful, and yet God still be good and sovereign. You've at least got to admit this. That most people who believe in God would recognize his power and his wisdom and things like that. But there is something about us being helpless sinners that reveal who God is in ways that we wouldn't know. That he moves towards broken people, not away from them. If it weren't for God being next to helpless sinners, we might never know the extent of how much he loves broken people. And if you and I don't see ourselves as Mephibosheth, you'll never know the extent of God's love and his friendship. And that means 2 things for us tonight. First point is by far the longest, so don't get scared. First, Mephibosheth really means this. There is no amount of guilt, there is no amount of wreckage in your life that makes you beyond the reach of God's kindness and friendship. Period. I don't care what just came up in your mind about what you've done. Right? I know there's some of you here sitting here tonight and you thought last night had nothing to do with you. You say, "Look, I know I'm not the good kid. The only reason I'm here is my dad made me come. I'm the one that everybody wonders why I'm here." Right? Or you might be saying, "Look, I came to RYM last year and I'm back this year and yep, got the same problems and issues I had last year. I still don't want to read my Bible. I still cut myself. I still think horrible thoughts." Or you might just be sick of the blatant hypocrisy, right? Because maybe you're here tonight and you're just exhausted of playing the game because you've kept up this good image. And your friends think you're great. And your parents think you're great. But the hidden parts of your life, they just don't know. And you hate the hypocrisy and you hate yourself. And you're saying, "Look, there's things that I've done that hardly anybody knows about. And I'm keeping it that way." And you tonight, what you would probably say is this: "I don't doubt that the God of this universe, Jesus Christ, can forgive and love people. I just doubt he can love and forgive and shower kindness on me." That's what you think. But see, by saying that there's no way that God can love and forgive and shower kindness on me because of my continual failure, it's actually reverting back to the obstacle we talked about last night. Because you're saying there's no way that God could love me because I can't offer anything lovable to him. The object of your faith is still yourself. You got to get over that. And you need to hear David say, "I want to show Mephibosheth kindness." You need to hear God tell Mephibosheth, "Welcome to the table." If you say, I see no reason for God to love me, man, I know that's hard. But it sounds to me like you're ready to admit that there's nothing in me that would draw God towards me. Therefore, it's going to have to be God and His grace. It sounds like you're at a great place tonight to be amazed by His love. Do you realize that what qualifies you to be a recipient of God's kindness, it is your weakness, it is your shame, it is your helplessness? It sounds crazy. I know it does. But you need to hear, welcome to the kindness of God, Mephibosheth. If you'll receive it, you get to be a trophy of His grace. It's amazing. But the second thing is this. The only way you get to receive friendship with God and experience His kindness is if you actually are willing to admit and acknowledge that you are a Mephibosheth, that you are a cripple that has nothing to offer God, that you are full of sin and shame, and that coming into God's presence should mean death. Right? This is what Paul says in Romans 5. This sounds like Mephibosheth, right? He says, while we were yet helpless, while we were yet sinners, while we were enemies, Christ died for us. This is the crazy upside-down nature of God's friendship, that He pursues sinful people. The only reason Mephibosheth received kindness from David is because David pursued him. Right? And I think you read about this in your devotional this morning, because I read it with you. The reason, if you are a believer tonight, that God's love rests on you, it's wrapped up in Him, not you. We bring weakness, we bring sin, we bring rebellion. He brings strength, love, and forgiveness. It makes no sense. It sounds too good to be true. But that's it. The only way to become friends with God is to actually admit that you're His enemy. But my question is, are you too prideful for that? Are you going to keep holding up the nice things about yourself and saying, here, this is why I'm better than those people. This is what's going to draw you to me. I'm telling you, believe me from experience. If God's friendship to you just kind of seems like this abstract notion that isn't exciting anymore, it's because you have an inaccurate view of yourself. It's because you've forgotten your Mephibosheth. Richie Sessions, who's speaking next week, used to say, as long as you have an inaccurate view of yourself, you will always have an inaccurate view of God's love. Will you own that you're Mephibosheth tonight? That's who David bestows kindness on. That's who God comes after. So, that's the recipient of God's friendship. What does the friendship look like? What is the kindness that's given, right? Verse 7 through 11. First point longest, I promise. Right? Remember I told you that he makes a promise back to Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20. And the promise is this: I will not cut off my love from Jonathan's descendants. That's what he pledges after he becomes king. I'll admit, I have no idea what was in the idea of Jonathan's mind when that pledge was made. I have no idea what was in David's mind when he made that pledge. But I'm telling you this: if all David meant by that promise was that he would not kill Jonathan's descendants, everybody would have thought that was incredibly merciful. Everybody would have said that's enough. But look what David does. He does more than spare Mephibosheth. He blesses him. He blesses him in absurd ways. He makes an enemy a friend. He makes a poor person rich, right, by assigning Ziba and these servants to be the servants of Mephibosheth so he can have an income. He gives him land. He puts a guy that used to not matter into a place of honor at the king's table. It's crazy. But none of that compares to what's said in verse 11. I didn't read this, my fault. David says this: Mephibosheth ate at David's table, did you hear it? Listen, like one of the king's sons. Here's the ultimate kindness. David bestows a new status on Mephibosheth. He gives him a new identity. If you walked into the king's palace and didn't know anything, there would be no visible difference between the status of Solomon, David's prized son, and Mephibosheth, the cripple. They both look the same. And David says to Mephibosheth, your identity will no longer be wrapped up in your shameful family, in your helplessness, or in your shameful past. Your identity, your status is now son of David, son of the king, loved by him. That's your new status. That's who you are. Look, I've got 2 little girls. One's 3.5, one's 1.5, which means the princess stuff has already started. The princess movie watching has already begun. And right now, my 3.5-year-old Shelby, one of her favorite movies, no surprise, right, what's shining through is Cinderella. And what we love about Cinderella, what shines through about Cinderella is what happens to her, right? Because who Cinderella is for the most of the movie is she's just a slave. She's living a life of poverty, right? Alone in a tower. She's treated horribly by her stepmother. She's made fun of constantly by her stepsisters. The only companions she has are these mice, right? She would have needed counseling, I promise. Disney treats her way too lightly. Her only friends are mice, okay? That's who she is. But yet something happens, right? Something so big, so cataclysmic happens to her. She gets discovered by a prince, and she gets a new identity, that she's a princess, and she's loved by a prince. And that new status is so cataclysmic, it's so life-changing that it releases her from anything else that used to define her. No longer does her poverty define her. No longer does the things that were said about her by her sisters define her. What defines her is her new status. And when David gives Mephibosheth a new status, a new identity, it was so big, it disenfranchised him from anything else that dared to define him. It was that good. Remember, this is a window into the heart of God. If you think David's kindness towards Mephibosheth is something, you ain't seen nothing yet. You know what it means for God to love you and befriend you? It's mind-boggling. How would you answer the question, why did Jesus come to this earth? Most of us would say, right, he came to die on a cross, forgive me of my sins so I don't have to go to hell. Correct. But man, that's the bare minimum. That's like he just spared you. Jesus didn't come just to spare you from hell. He came to give you a new status, his bride. He has set his everlasting, never giving up, always forever love on you, and you are his. At the heart of what it means for God to befriend you is that he gives you a new status. That you're the son of a king. That you're the bride of Jesus. And it has nothing to do with whether you've earned it or not. Mephibosheth didn't do anything to earn it, right? David just gave it to him. Friendship with God means you once were an enemy. You once were a cripple, and now your status is mine, says God. Son of the High King. That's your status if you are friends with Jesus today, whether you feel it or not. And that has to start releasing you. It has to be so good that it releases you from everything else that dares to define you. All right, some of you are convinced that your identity is simply the accumulation of the shameful things that you've done with your body, or the distorted lust, or the homosexual desires you've been fighting. And friendship with God means God looks at you and says, no, that's not who you are. You're not defined by the things that you've done. You are my daughter, child of the King. And that has to free you from your former identity because it's so good. Right? You think your identity is bound up in the fact that you were abused by your parents. I realize that leaves scars that seem like they'll never go away. But your God says, no. Don't you dare think that's your identity. Your status is that you are my son. You're at my table. That's your identity. You who think that who you are is bound up in what others have said about you in your past or what a certain group thinks about you. Friendship with God means that God says, don't you dare think that way. You are cleansed, forgiven, and loved by the Father. That's who you are. That's your identity. Right? I see this happen all the time. That there will be the great guy who comes to college, or the great girl, and all of a sudden she goes crazy her freshman year. And everybody says, whoa, she went off the deep end. Do you know what happened? I don't want to make this too simplistic, but what happened was that guy's identity, who he was simply what other people thought of him. And in high school, what got him patted on the back was being the good person at church. And all of a sudden he got to college. And what got you in with people was something different. And so that's what he went for. That's what happens. And that identity has to be changed by Jesus. Right? Or I watch this happen all the time. That you go to college, right? You've been awesome in high school. And all of a sudden you've been told that your freshman year is supposed to be awesome, and all of a sudden you're miserable and lonely, and you just break. And you're depressed. What happened? Your identity actually was either like your athletic achievements, or what people thought of you in high school, or who you were in youth group. And all of a sudden you walked into a place and nobody cares about that stuff anymore. And you don't know who you are. You've put your identity in things that are just transient. And Jesus has to change that. I'm not saying that doesn't make loneliness not sad. It just doesn't crush you anymore. Because the heart of friendship with God is a new status that never changes and never goes away. And you're His. Look, I do want to point something else out. Not only does He give a new status, a new friendship, that's where His kindness comes. Look at verse 7. It's continual. I never saw this until I really studied this passage. David looks at Mephibosheth and says, you will eat at my table, the place of honor, the place of feasting. Here it is. Always. Always. I want you to think about this. That means every single day, for the rest of Mephibosheth's life, David made a way for Mephibosheth to look around and experience the kindness of David every day. Every day he would eat something and say, well, here's another meal I don't deserve. David's kindness was always a present reality to Mephibosheth. David didn't let him leave it in his past. Right, don't you love that scene in Harry Potter when, the first one, Harry, right, has, he's got these adopted parents and they just treat him horribly, and he lives under a staircase, another guy that probably actually needed counseling and never got it. And all of a sudden, right, the house starts shaking, and if you read the book, you're like, here comes Hagrid, right? And the door gets pounded down, and in walks the giant Hagrid. And he says, Harry! And Harry's quaking in fear, and the adopted parents start kind of protesting, telling him to get out of here, and all of a sudden it clicks with Hagrid. And he looks at the parents and says, you never told him, did you? You never told him who his parents were. And Harry said, they told me that they died in a car wreck. And he gets furious. He says, they told you they died in a car wreck? And the rest of Harry Potter is unfolding the fact that who he is actually the recipient of sacrificial love because his parents gave their lives for him because he was so precious. And the rest of the movie is him trying to own who he really is. And he keeps forgetting it. And how often is the craziness in our life is because God's kindness to us, God's grace to us, we've relegated it to this past event. And there's nothing exciting about it in the present. Right? Honestly, how much of our boredom with Jesus is because we've just relegated His friendship as something exciting as just something that happened back then. Maybe even tonight you're tasting in the identity of being the son of the high king of heaven, and it's great. But then you leave here and you go out and you eat dinner, and all of a sudden, right, stories start being told, and all of a sudden you join in and you gossip and you just rip that girl to shreds. Why? Because it just would have been awkward to stop it. And it's just a lot more attractive to have your identity being in with that crew. And all of a sudden, your status of being the high king of heaven's son, it's just this distant past, right? It's what's happening to us, right? Wouldn't it be crazy for a preacher to stand up and tell you that your identity is secure in him, that you are the high King of heaven, loved by him, and it can never change? And then he preaches that to you, and then he actually leaves, and he has a hard time going to bed at night because he just wonders if you like him. That's crazy. That's me. I realized this morning that what was driving me crazy is what I thought about what 16-year-old guys thought of me. How crazy is that? But the kindness and identity of Jesus Christ and being his bride was far in my background. And God has made a way that you can daily experience his grace and his identity. And you know how he does it? This is going to sound crazy. One of the reasons that God doesn't just snap his fingers and make all your sin problems go away tomorrow, right? He could do that. You ever get frustrated with that? Why didn't he just do that? It's because the new identity that he gives you is one that's characterized as, I'm one who has received immense mercy. And what if one of the things that emblazons that into your soul is when you realize that the forgiveness and mercy of Jesus is not just this past event in my life, but it's a present reality every day. Because growing as a Christian actually means that you realize more and more how messed up you are. I'm not saying you sin more, but you start seeing more and more who you actually are. And the mercy of Jesus becomes more and more precious as you walk 10 years with Jesus, 20 years with Jesus, and at the end of your life, the identity of you being one who has received sweet mercy just rules you. Which means if you don't recognize your identity today, it's not because his kindness isn't present, it's because you're not. And you've probably forgotten who you are. And so it's continual. And lastly, I really will finish here because it's time. Look at the response to friendship. What is this supposed to do to us? Verse 8. Mephibosheth's response, he's just in complete shock. He just asks, why me? Why would you love a dead dog like me? Right? He has an accurate view of himself, so he's amazed at David's love towards him, and it astounds him. And you say, okay, I know. My response always to God befriending me should be constant amazement. And I wish I was, but I'm not. And let me just remind you of what this story means. That if you right now are looking at your lack of love for God and your lack of amazement at his love for you, don't stay there. Don't stay there. Run to the kindness of God with that, not away from it. The way back is to be overwhelmed again with the kindness of God that he still loves you today, just like he did yesterday, if you have the new identity in him. Which means if you felt like you were pounded tonight and you're walking into self-pity, stop. Run back to Jesus with that and be amazed at your new identity. But it also means this, and this is what I'll close with, and this is the best thing. I've talked about my kids tonight, so one more. There is nothing like when your first child is born. Right? My first child was Shelby. Shelby, our oldest, really is funny, right? Liza, my wife, when she was pregnant, right, for 9 months, what you begin to realize is that Shelby, she did nothing for us while in the womb, right? Actually, all she did is cause pain to my wife. She caused discomfort. She inhibits her sleeping, which also inhibited my sleeping. She cost me a lot of money in medical bills. She did nothing but bring mess and disaster. She contributed nothing. Yet, the moment that she was born, the first moment that I saw her, I knew I'd die for her if it needed to happen. I knew that there was nothing she could do to sever my love. Why? Because it's obvious the stuff that she did for me didn't make her love me. It didn't make me love her. And if what makes me love her is not the stuff that she did for me, that means the reason that I love her is wrapped up in me. That she is the object of my affection. And the love began with me, and I get to say when it's going to end, and it never will. You see, if we're Mephibosheth, and all we do is contribute pain and failure and sin, if that's true, that means he doesn't love you because the good stuff that you will bring to him is actually far better. That means Jesus had a choice when he was standing there looking at the cross. He said, I can avoid suffering, I can avoid pain, I can avoid the wrath of God, and what that means is I'll never have you as a friend. Or I can go to the cross. And he goes to the cross. Why? The only explanation is that because he gets you. You're the object of his affection. And he thought it well worth his while. And we're Mephibosheth. And if your good stuff didn't start God loving you, then your bad stuff will never make it end. Because it's you he's after. It's you that he loves. You, Mephibosheth. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that a God worth living and dying for? Jesus offers a new, unchanging status that frees you from anything else that dares to identify you. And it's free. The question is, will you receive it? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the incredible picture, the incredible window into your heart that David gives us, that you love. You love people who weren't even looking for you, who were hiding in the corners of the world, hoping you wouldn't find them. And you do. And you bestow on us forgiveness, righteousness, and a new status, saying that you are going to sit at my table and be treated like one of my sons. Lord, the refreshing truth of that roll over us again tonight and give us real joy. In your Son's name I pray. Amen.